Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast. As always, I'm your host, Kyle, and today we're talking about something very central to Russian identity and culture, and something that I am not personally super familiar with. That something, or rather someone, is Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin. I'm almost certain that you have at least heard of the name Pushkin. Before I got into Russia, Russian language, Russian literature, any of that stuff, I had already heard Pushkin. He's pretty well known outside of Russia and in circles that aren't really into Russia. Alexander Pushkin is one of the single most famous authors in the history of, well, ever. And that goes doubly, triply, quadruply, infinitely, I don't know, a ton more, for the people of Russia. As someone who went to school for Russian language and Russian history, Pushkin was someone you heard about a lot. And even before then, as I was saying, he's someone that I was already pretty familiar with. But once you start talking about Russia, it is very, very hard to get away from this man. He is one of, if not the most important and influential Russian authors ever. Not only is he particularly important to Russian language and Russian history as a man who has had a strangely outsized influence on the Russian language, he is also somebody who has put out some huge amounts of very influential Russian literature that has not just affected kind of Russian culture and even Russian language, but also Russian literature. Something I think many people would be surprised to know is that Russia is a very literary society. Books, poetry, and short stories have been, for a very long time, and still very much so are, a central part of Russian culture. And authors are the kinds of social heroes that usually only military people can really become in other societies. So, what I'm getting at is Pushkin is maybe one of the most influential, popular, and well-known Russians ever. At least in Russia. I would be absolutely floored if you could find me a random Russian person off the street who isn't familiar, at least a little bit, with the works of Pushkin. In many ways, I like to think of Pushkin much like the way that I think of Shakespeare here in the US. Pushkin not only typified Russian literature, but really made it into what we know it as now. I have heard at a number of different times that Pushkin is, in a number of ways, the father of not only modern Russian literature, but even has had a very outsized role in the creation of the modern Russian language. While Pushkin did not exactly found the Russian language, not even close, or even really create Russian literature, as well some people might say, he did have a very uniquely outsized role in what we would call the modern Russian language and modern Russian literature. What I mean by this is, of course, there was Russian literature before Pushkin, and absolutely, of course, there was the Russian language before Pushkin. But before Pushkin, the Russian literature out there was dominated by well-to-do aristocrats who engaged in the high literature of places like England, France, Italy, and then, of course, the classics of places like Greece and Rome. What Pushkin did was he translated the stories of these kind of older and foreign masters into a Russian theme. Pushkin would write epic poems, novels, and short stories that were uniquely Russian. Not only in simple ways like, say, rewriting an old story in a Russian setting or with Russian characters, but instead by intertwining Russian cultural themes and motifs into those stories, and of course also with Russian characters and in Russian places. And in particular, by weaving in the themes and motifs of Russian folklore. This was something particularly new for Russian literature, because Russia was not a super literate country at this point. It was a literary country in the sense that kind of writing, literature, and whatnot were very influential and were very big, but this is, of course, where most of the people who can read are, that being the aristocracy, the gentry, stuff like that. At this point in time, the vast majority of people in Russia could not read. Most of the dudes writing were these wealthy people, and they would probably die of being grossed out and mortified by the horrible manners of the average peasant serf in about 30 seconds or less. So, a lot of what we consider Russian culture didn't really exist at these higher levels of society. All the Russian folklore, myths, and legends were pretty squarely kept in the poor people department. And these dudes were particularly, not literate, so they weren't writing a lot of this stuff down. The time we are talking about here for Pushkin's life is the late 1700s and early to mid 1800s. So either you're landed gentry or you're a fucking serf. So there's not a lot of crossover. You have your wealthy people who are writing literature, and you have your not wealthy people who are doing folklore, and they're not really crossing over. But Pushkin would just so happen to come up in a time in which some of these strong boundaries were starting to kind of blur. Well, only a little bit. These would never really come down, these boundaries, but certain little gaps were appearing in the early 1800s, and it was becoming much more common for rich, wealthy people to see the serfs as actual people. Now, don't get me wrong, this was a very small number of rich, wealthy people, and the amount of contact that they had with the serfs was nominal, really, at best. But as they say, 1% is literally infinitely greater than 0%. So, it was happening, they were doing it, and it was having some effect. Pushkin was firmly in the camp of the liberalized, enlightened, aristocrat gentryman, and he intertwined the motifs and stories that he learned from these serfs and peasants and servants and such into his own works. But this is really all I kind of want to get into about his literature. I'm personally not a super big literary guy, though I have read a decent bit of Pushkin, and he has written some of the works that I particularly like from the 1800s. Some of my favorites, actually, I would say, are Pushkin's. And Pushkin, other than my own personal opinion, wrote something like a few hundred poems and short stories, so he's, of course, a very important literary person. But I don't think that we can really do him justice talking about his literary effect as well as his historical effect. Besides, a lot of these stories really deserve their own deep dives. A lot of them are really interesting and have really unique social, political, religious, whatever kind of undertones and meanings that deserve their own in-depth discussion. So, I don't think we can really do that here today. So, for today, what I want you to know is the broad strokes of what Pushkin's literary legacy was. Because now we're going to be discussing the life of Alexander Pushkin. And boy howdy, he was a pretty fucking wild dude. And honestly, that's kind of why I want to do it this way. Pushkin's history is pretty nuts and is honestly really interesting. And it's not really as often discussed as his works, fair enough. Outside of his literature, Pushkin's effects on the world were pretty limited. But I do want to take a moment to just talk about Pushkin the man. So, if you want to do some reading, go ahead, go read some Pushkin. I really highly recommend it. You certainly will not regret it. But for now, we're going to leave behind the literature and get into the life and times of Russia's most famous dueling, drinking, extremist fuckboy. Our story begins today on May 26, 1799. On this day in history, a fresh Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin entered the world to a wealthy boyar family. And already at birth, Pushkin's story starts off a little bit wild. On his mother's side, Pushkin's great-grandfather was a man of quite a bit of fame already in Russia. His great-grandfather was from Africa. I'm talking about a man named Abram Hannibal. Hannibal is a man who absolutely deserves an episode all on his own because he's a really neat guy, and I promise you he will get one. Long and short of it, Hannibal is an African man, either from Abyssinia or somewhere in Central Africa. There's a decent amount of debate on this, and no one is entirely sure. But we are certain that he is from Africa. Hannibal was purchased as a slave by Peter the Great in Constantinople. He was then brought back to Russia and was actually made a Russian citizen, became an advisor to the Tsar, and even became a general in the Russian imperial military. And then, a few generations later, Hannibal's legacy would be carried on by Pushkin. So, we're already off to a pretty good start for a guy who is about exactly 1 second old in this story. Pushkin's childhood was pretty normal for a wealthy boyar's kid. He was raised mostly by his mother's mother, where he was taught about all the kind of normal cultural shit of the day, that being French. In fact, French was the language that most of the dealings of the upper crust were being done in at that time. But he did get something a little bit different. His grandma was a bit of a traditionalist. Pushkin spent a lot of time around his grandma and the serfs that she employed? Owned. In particular, there was a serf who served as Pushkin's nanny that raised Pushkin up on a lot of the kind of classic Russian folk stories. This is one thing that kind of separated Pushkin from a lot of the other upper crust dandies. It was very common for the wealthy landowners of Russia to have their serfs raise their kids for them. But Pushkin was raised in a particularly close contact kind of situation with them, and became quite familiar with traditional Russian culture in a way that a lot of other money and power types didn't always get. But I do want to kind of pump the brakes here real quick. This is not to say that Pushkin was some kind of down-to-earth everyman. Oh no, not quite. While it is true that Pushkin would certainly have a certain affinity for the serfs of the Russian Empire, he was absolutely a rich kid from day one to the very end. I think it's really well put that as a kid he spent a lot of time hanging around serfs on his parents' Moscow estate. I think that really kind of represents who he was. Pushkin was a romantic, both in the lovey-dovey and in the literary sense. He seemed to really love and care a lot about the concept of Russia and of the Russian people and its culture. But you can never forget that the people he was so interested in worked land owned and who themselves were owned by his very family. But anywho, when he wasn't hanging out with the serfs, he was out doing pretty normal childhood stuff. He was known as a very imaginative kid who spent a lot of time out playing and kind of getting lost in his own head. And other than generally just being a kid and spending a lot of time with the peasantry, Pushkin spent a lot of time reading. He was considered a pretty smart kid, and also a very well-connected one, at least through his family. And that's actually how he ended up being a bit of a guinea pig for some fancy-pants new school that was starting to take off in the year 1811. At the age of 12, Pushkin was one of the 30 students who were enrolled in the inaugural class of the Imperial Lyceum at Tsarskaya Selo. He would stay there for about 6 years until he graduated in 1817. The Lyceum was a bit of a novel thing back then, and actually kind of somewhat of a novel thing today still. Not only was it a school, which at that time for most people was a hell of a lot more than they'd ever see, it was a school for what we would today call the liberal arts. It was a really big deal back then, and was actually founded by the ministers of education and justice, and its founding was personally approved by the Tsar himself. And just to make sure that it was fancy enough, the school was held in the Catherine Palace. This meant that Pushkin would have received probably the best education possible in the entire Russian Empire, and a pretty decent education for the entire fucking planet. And quickly, he started to make a bit of a name for himself as a particularly smart cookie. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was 14 years old, I hadn't done all too much of anything of any serious consequence. But apparently, being the guy who founds an entire country's literary scene isn't enough for Pushkin. So, he had to go and be a giant fucking show-off and get himself published in 1814 at the ripe old age of 14. His poem, To My Friend the Poet, was published in the literary magazine Vestnik Evropy, or The Messenger of Europe. Pretty quickly, it was clear to the people of Russia that this guy had some pretty serious fucking chops. Only a year later, the famous Russian poet Dervazhin lauded Pushkin for another one of his works, Recollections in Tsarskaya Selo, which, remember, he's 15 now. At the Lyceum, he also started on his first of his major works, that being Ruslan y Ludmila. It's a narrative poem set in a Russian setting that drew inspiration directly from Russian folklore. This is kind of what I was talking about before. The concept of a narrative poem isn't new, certainly not even new in Russia, but a Russian one about Russians set in Russia based on Russian culture, now that was new. This is what really made Pushkin the man we know him today. After completing his education, Pushkin did what so many other well-to-do young men did. He joined the civil service. For people of his status, it was really either do that or go into the military. And, well, he didn't go to a military school, so that ship had kind of already sailed. So, in 1817, Pushkin accepted a post in the Foreign Office of St. Petersburg, kind of like the State Department in the US. But realistically, what he did for work doesn't actually fucking matter, because Pushkin basically just didn't work. This was a wonderful position for him to kind of just do whatever the hell he wanted. So, that's exactly what he did. He spent the majority of his time just goofing off, drinking fancy wine, hanging with fancy people, and of course, writing. It was at this time that Pushkin started to dip his toes a little bit into politics. You see, at this time in Russian history, liberal politics had a bit of a following to it. Within the well-to-do sectors of Russian society, there was a bit of a counterculture, if you will. These were mostly fairly milquetoast liberals, at least as we would call them today, who just wanted to see some restrictions put on, say, the Tsar's power, maybe wanted to see some shit like a constitution, or interested in things like freeing the serfs. This might sound all pretty boring and kind of center of the aisle to you or me, but we don't live in the Russian Empire. To the Russian Empire, this kind of talk is borderline treasonous, and if you were caught talking like this, you could easily get yourself into some pretty serious trouble. For this reason, these kinds of discussions were generally done behind closed doors and only amongst friends. At this time, secret societies were popular the world over, think like the stonemasons or the Illuminati. But they were particularly in vogue in Russia with these liberals who wanted to discuss some of these touchy topics, things like checks and balances. Pushkin was one of those people. Shortly after accepting his post in 1817, he was admitted into the Arzamas Society. This was not a particularly serious society, but was mostly a literary group that, they'd get together and talk some shit about conservatives. But then, in 1818, Pushkin kind of kicked it up a gear, got a little bit more serious. He joined what was called the Green Lamp Association. This was technically just a fancy book club, at least on paper. But in reality, it was actually an offshoot of a political organization known as the Union of Welfare. The Union of Welfare was a large for secret society group that would ultimately be really well known to everyone when in 7 or so years they would attempt to overthrow the government. But we'll get to that later. Being that Pushkin was hanging out with people who would one day commit a coup against the sitting government, he picked a little bit of this up and, kind of incorporated it into his beliefs and into his writings. But before he could really get sucked in, the Russian government caught wind of what he was up to. Remember when I said these kinds of ideas were a bit of a big deal to the Russian government? Yeah, well, they were. And between the years of 1817 and 1820, Pushkin was maybe just a little bit too loose-lipped with some of these ideas, and so the government took action in the May of 1820. As it turns out, the Russian government had been reading some of the poetry that Pushkin had been putting out, and they had noticed some of the political messaging and ideas that he'd been putting in there. So the federales showed up to Pushkin, and they said, "All right, bub, St. Petersburg is a nice town, and it ain't the kind of place for shitheads like you." So they exiled him. Well, exile's such a harsh word. And remember, Pushkin's a son of a boyar. He's a gentleman. So he wasn't really on paper exiled. Instead, he was just reassigned to somewhere that wasn't St. Petersburg. But in reality, he was exiled. This somewhere that wasn't St. Petersburg would be the town of Yekaterinoslav, or what is now the city of Dnipro in Ukraine. And while he was not allowed back in St. Petersburg, at least for the time being, Pushkin was still allowed to more or less kind of move around and do what he wanted. So he continued to do so. The early 1820s saw Pushkin kind of start to hit his stride. Not as an author, but as a fucking menace to society. This dude hit the scene like a fucking trust fund kid right out of college. Which, realistically, that's kind of exactly what he was. Pushkin drank, slept, and fought his way all across the Caucasus and Crimea. Kind of neat thing to note here is during the early 1820s is when Pushkin wrote The Prisoner of the Caucasus. This is a really neat story that one day I will do a whole episode on. This is one of my favorite stories because what's so neat about it, and also what's really kind of incredibly depressing, is that a number of authors have written the same story under the same name, but set at different periods of time. This is because the Russian Empire, and then later the Russian Federation, were basically at all times fighting some kind of war, separatist movement, or insurrection in the region. This includes the 1990s film adaptation set in the First Chechen War. It's a really interesting literary tradition that I promise I will talk about one day, and is a story I'm actually a little bit more familiar with because I've read a couple of these and I've seen the movie, and I don't know, it's just really neat, so I just want to put that in here. Anyhow, Pushkin continued to be a giant party hardy. The main thing to remember about Pushkin is he was romantic. And I mean that, again, both in the literary and the emotional way. His stories were often about people being overwhelmed by emotion, pride, honor, love, what have you. And this was the way that Pushkin lived his life, especially starting now. If you want to get a sense of what Pushkin was about, and what he saw as kind of an admirable man, you should read the short story, The Shot. The whole thing is about a lover scorned, impugned honor, and an expert marksman. These were things that Pushkin was really into, himself being a pretty prolific duelist, and who, much the seeming self-insert character Count Sylvia would, spent a decent amount of his time practicing pistol marksmanship inside his own house, just blasting rounds into his wall. Which one, I know it's the 1800s and we don't get, health yet, but Jesus Christ, dude, that's a lot of fucking lead to just have in your house. And two, come on, dude, what the fuck? You can't do this outside? His dueling was a huge part of his personal identity, and also a huge part of the way that people think of him now. There's actually some debate as to how many duels Pushkin fought, but as the story goes, it was 26. Though, to be fair, many of these would ultimately be cancelled when satisfaction was found some other way. But realistically, we don't know how many duels he fought. What we do know is that he did in fact fight in at least a few, because Pushkin, the idealist romantic that he was, really valued things like honor, which is why, as the story goes, he even challenged his own uncle to a duel, his very first duel in fact. But anyhow, his dueling, emotionality, and strive for adventure really kicked into high gear in the 1820s. As such, this period was, as the historians call it, the beginning of Pushkin's fuckboy era, which, to be fair, lasted almost right up to his death, so at least he's consistent. This really kicked into high gear when in 1823, Pushkin, after calling in some favors with friends who had not been exiled, was transferred to Odessa. During this time, Pushkin built up a good bit of bad blood between himself and the other members of the Russian Foreign Office by trying to sleep with their wives, something that he pulled off not once, but twice at the same time. This was also a very productive time for him as a writer. It was during this time that he began what many consider to be his greatest work, Yevgeny Onegin, or Eugene Onegin. As well, Pushkin continued to produce short stories and poems that cemented his place as a talented writer and not just a kind of flash in the pan during the 18 teens. But this space Pushkin found himself in would not last very long, because whatever you have to say about Pushkin, he was a bit of a stubborn man and he was very driven by his convictions. So, even having been exiled already, he did not slow down on his criticisms of the Russian government and on Russian society. In response, the Russian government kind of just ping-ponged him all over the empire, sending him to different posts and then uprooting him and just sending him somewhere else. And believe it or not, Pushkin didn't really like this. Constantly being shuffled around and not allowed to return home or exist as a normal member of society really kind of fucked with his head, and he fell on hard times. Though, these were not monetary hard times, but more like mental, emotional hard times. Pushkin started lashing out through his behavior and in his writing. Pushkin really started to get into some serious debauchery here. He became a serious menace and the center of a number of scandals as he was constantly drinking, fighting, dueling, and sleeping around. At one point, even trying to sleep with his superior's wife, all while his superior, who was a count, mind you, was totally aware that this was going on and was actively trying to have Pushkin reassigned. But what really finally nailed Pushkin down was not his behavior, but once again, his writing. This time, Pushkin was even less subtle in his letters and stated that he was, quote, taking lessons in pure atheism. The Russian government, an overtly orthodox organization, was not about to let that slide. So, in 1824, the Russian government effectively sent Pushkin to his room in maybe the most literal way possible. I want to point out something real quick. Pushkin was exiled first in 1820, and then now we're in 1824. It took him only 4 years to get into a number of duels, affairs, and then be exiled for a second time. Whatever you can say about the guy, he sure acts fast. So, the government exiled Pushkin to his mother's estate in Mikhailovskaya, near the town of Pskov. Pushkin would spend the next 2 years here under house arrest. This would, understandably, be a pretty unhappy time for Pushkin, as he was not allowed to go anywhere or really interact with anyone, and he was under constant supervision by the government. And yet, they still let him keep a gun on him. Yeah, this is when he really got into shooting holes in his walls. But, conversely, this would be maybe one of the most productive writing periods in his career, if not the most, at least one of the two. With nothing but time on his hands, Pushkin dove head first into studying Russian history and culture. He spent a lot of time getting to know the peasants that worked on the estate and learned a lot about their traditions, songs, and folk tales. Pushkin then turned around and injected this Russianness into his stories and poetry. And this is really where Pushkin started to kind of hit his stride as the Russian poetry man. He had been doing this for some time before, but now this was front and center in just about everything he was doing. And then, about halfway through his exile, something pretty fucking nuts happened. The Decembrist Revolt kicked off in December of 1825. I will go into the Decembrist Revolt later. That's going to be the topic of next week's episode because it really deserves its own thing and it ties into this quite a bit. But the main thing we need to know about it for now is that the revolt was a bunch of wealthy liberal aristocrats who wanted things like a constitution, checks and balances, and to free the serfs, who, ultimately tried to do a little palace coup and overthrow the government. Uh-oh. We've heard this before. This kind of talk was exactly the stuff that got Pushkin in trouble in the first place. And Pushkin, well, he was 100% aware of it. And then, to make matters worse, like all of the Decembrist leadership had copies of Pushkin's early, more critical political works. And to make things even worser, pretty much all the Decembrist leaders currently were, at that time, or had been earlier, members of the Union of Welfare. Remember those guys? Yeah. Pushkin was a member of the Green Lamp Society, which was an offshoot of the Union of Welfare. Oops. Pushkin's starting to look pretty screwed. So, Pushkin decided he needed to take action. He knew that only an idiot couldn't see his direct and indirect links to the people who had just marched soldiers onto the steps of the Winter Palace and tried to depose the Tsar. So, he started burning documents like there was no tomorrow, because for him, that was a very real possibility. He destroyed pretty much anything and everything that he thought could incriminate himself, his friends, or his family. And then the cops showed up. And then the cops left. And Pushkin wasn't in irons, and he wasn't being dragged to the gallows. Quite the opposite. Instead, the Tsar released Pushkin from exile. What the police ultimately found was that, sure, Pushkin was linked to a lot of these Decembrist guys, and he did agree with them on a lot of stuff, but broadly speaking, he was pretty harmless, and he was really far away from it, probably wasn't really involved. He certainly hadn't done anything in concert with the Decembrists. While they were all out there doing a coup and whatnot, Pushkin was locked up in his house, talking to serfs, reading about Peter the Great, and trying to shoot tin cans in his bedroom. So, the Tsar not only released Pushkin, but he called him up and told him to drop by. So, on September 8th, 1826, Alexander Pushkin met Tsar Nikolai I. And they had a nice little chat. The Tsar asked Pushkin about things and stuff and whatnot, and Pushkin told him about his exile and about his complaints about the Russian government, in particular, its censorship of his works. So, Nikolai did something that Pushkin was a bit of a fan of. Nikolai said, I hear you, man. Yeah, this whole giant bureaucracy, autocracy, empire thing, it's real drag, right? So, don't you worry about any of that anymore. These censors, forget them. You don't need them, kid. Instead, just send your stuff direct to me, and I will look it over and give it my blessing. So Pushkin was like, yeah, sounds pretty rad to me. So there he is, Alexander Pushkin in 1826. He, unlike roughly 500 other people, would not be taken to court over his connections to the Decembrists, he would not be exiled to Siberia, he would not be executed, and he would not be put in prison. Instead, he would be allowed to walk free, and seems to have even made some pretty serious gains in his rights department from even before his exile. Pushkin entered back into normal society with his head held high and with some serious hopes for the future, just in time for all that to come crashing down like a ton of bricks. After he was released from exile, Pushkin went to Moscow and quickly found out that the deal he had with the Tsar might honestly not be as prime as he thought it was gonna be. Almost immediately upon arriving in Moscow, Pushkin was approached by a man named Count Benkendorf. Count Benkendorf was the chief of the Russian gendarmes, basically the police. Benkendorf told Pushkin that he had his eye on him, and that if Pushkin so much as sneezed, he would know about it, and that if Pushkin wanted to do anything, Benkendorf would have to be the one to personally approve it. And when I say do anything, I mean do anything. If Pushkin wanted to, I don't know, leave town, if he wanted to publish something, wanted to join a literary group, or if he even wanted to meet with certain people who were deemed too important or too dangerous, he would have to run it by his friend, the chief. As well, the Tsar kind of turned out to not be as sympathetic as Pushkin had originally hoped. As it turns out, the Tsar was a much harsher critic and censor than anyone else Pushkin had ever had to deal with. And being that this new censor was the Tsar, wiggle room was not something Pushkin was really allowed anymore. And then, socially, Pushkin was pretty dead in the water as well. Not only was Pushkin basically grounded by Count Benkendorf, but he also lost a lot of his popularity because of his image. Pushkin had been exiled, twice now, placed under house arrest, was linked to a terrorist group, and had espoused atheism, and was currently being investigated and observed by the police at basically all times. While the Russian upper crust did in fact have a certain liberal streak, that was always a much smaller, less powerful group within the greater, more traditionalist whole, and that certainly was not the case anymore. There certainly weren't a lot of liberals now in 1826 and 1827, at least not vocal ones, considering that a lot of those more liberal guys were either dead, in prison, exiled in Siberia, or like Pushkin, under pretty serious observation and scrutiny by the Russian police. So, Pushkin kind of found himself alone. But, much like his time in Mikhailovskaya, this time of depression yielded some of his most famous works, even if the Tsar was still critiquing every word. And as the 1820s came to an end, and Pushkin's 30s loomed in his headlights, he decided now, after everything, it was a good time to settle down and find himself a wife and start a family. But Pushkin being Pushkin, he was not just gonna marry some random old lady. No. Instead, he was going to find the most beautiful woman in all of Russia, and only then would he get married. Now, if you ask me, this sounds like the talk of a man who doesn't really want to get married, so he sets those standards a little high, so, he doesn't have to. But hey, who knows? Either way, apparently he did it. In 1829, Pushkin met Natalia Goncharova, and in 1831, they were married. Shortly after marrying, they decided to hit the bricks and leave Moscow behind. Moscow was a little too at the center of everything for Pushkin, who felt crowded by all of the high society folks that, he didn't really get along with. So they moved to Tsarskaya Selo at the edge of St. Petersburg. But then a cholera outbreak happened in St. Petersburg, and the royal family moved to Tsarskaya Selo too. So, to avoid the Tsar, Pushkin moved his family into the now cholera-ridden St. Petersburg. But, try as he might, Pushkin could not avoid the fancy folk of Russian high society forever. And in particular, he could not escape the Tsar. You see, the problem with marrying the most beautiful woman in all of Russia is that all these people are going to want to see her, and they're going to want to be around her, and they're going to get these weird parasocial attachments to her. One of such people would be the Tsar Nikolai I. This was not made better by the fact that Madame Pushkina was particularly fond of this attention, and she really liked getting kind of, looks and admiration for her looks, and she was a big fan of court life and really liked St. Petersburg. Pushkin, on the other hand, not a fan. Pushkin had been commissioned by the government to write a history of Peter the Great. He was writing on his own works at the time. He was trying to start a literary magazine, and he was trying to keep up with the Joneses in high society. Now, mind you, one of said Joneses was the Tsar, one of the most powerful and wealthy people on the entire damn planet. So let's just say Pushkin was a little bit out of his element, and he was also a little bit out of money. Court life ain't cheap, man. And then Pushkin found himself in a couple of scandals. The first would be that the Tsar appointed Pushkin to the rank of, oh boy, Kammerjunker? I don't know what the fuck that is exactly. It's some kind of weird court thing with a funky-ass German name. Basically, it's a really low-tier court position, very low on the ladder, and is usually given to children as a kind of baby's first court position. This, understandably, pissed Pushkin off pretty damn bad. One, this was a pretty clear insult on his honor by the Tsar, and two, to make things worse, he was certain, and was probably right too, that this was just a ploy by the Tsar to keep the Pushkins at court so the Tsar could ogle over Pushkin's wife. And three, the Pushkins were already having troubles keeping their finances in order with the amount of court shit they were already doing. So this did not help. So Pushkin, a man of honor and fiery romantic emotion, decided he would have his revenge. He would get the better of the Tsar. He would write a litany of letters to the Tsar telling him just how angry he was and how unfair this was, and that he would take his cushy job, wad it up, and throw in the Tsar's face. So Pushkin wrote the Tsar his resignation, and he officially resigned from his post on June 25th, 1834, in protest of the treatment he was receiving at court. And then Pushkin seemingly remembered how he got himself into this mess in the first place. He remembered how he ended up with all these burnt bridges, and how the Tsar had turned his life into a living hell. And then he politely rescinded his resignation in order to not have the Tsar's full wrath dropped on him. And then things really started to get out of hand. It was one thing for Alexander Pushkin to be under the thumb of the Tsar, his censorship, and his jackbooted bureaucrats. It was something else for Pushkin to be beaten at his own game. The 1830s saw family man Pushkin hit the scene, but never forget that the Pushkin of the 1820s was a total hazard at court. He was going after any woman that he liked, no matter if she was interested, married, or if she was married, who she was married to. So it must have been quite a surprise for Pushkin when he found it was his own wife who was in the sights of some young upstart trust fund baby named Danthus. Danthus, in ways not too dissimilar to the way Pushkin had courted people in the past, courted Madame Pushkina in broad daylight before pretty much everyone, and made very few attempts to hide what he was doing and what his intentions were. This would go on for about 2 years before Pushkin ever did anything about it. And ultimately, what forced Pushkin to action was that on November 4th, 1836, he received several copies of a certificate that nominated him the coadjutor of the International Order of Cuckolds. Dude was straight up being cuck-shamed. Pushkin would not stand for this, and immediately challenged Danthus to a duel. This duel was then postponed twice, and ultimately was called off when Pushkin learned that Danthus wasn't actually after his wife, but instead was trying to get with his wife's sister. So, on January 10th of 1837, Danthus married Madame Pushkina's sister, and everyone was happy. No, not really. This did not assuage Pushkin. He did not attend the wedding, and then he would not allow the new couple into his home. And then Danthus, now a married man, continued to pursue Pushkin's wife at court, and did so even more blatantly and openly. This all boiled over when Danthus cooked up a scheme to try and get Madame Pushkina alone at his house. Danthus had a different court lady invite Madame Pushkina over, and then had her dip out, thus leaving himself alone with Madame Pushkina. Madame Pushkina was not okay with this, and fled from Danthus. She fled home and told her husband about what had happened. Pushkin then sent out a flurry of angry letters to Danthus's father, accusing him of creating the cuckold certificate, and then went to challenge Danthus to a duel. So, on a chilly January 27th, 1837, I'd like to point out that is 17 days after Dianthus got married to Madame Pushkina's sister. Oy vey. So, on a chilly January 27th, 1837, Dianthus and Pushkin met each other on the field of honor. Dianthus took the first shot and mortally wounded Pushkin. Pushkin, who had collapsed to the ground, mustered up just enough strength to fire his one shot at Dianthus, which, to be fair, did hit Dianthus, but did not injure him, not all too badly. 2 days later, on January 29th, 1837, at the age of 37, Alexander Pushkin, much like another famous Alexander who was killed in a duel, died of his wounds and has, as of yet, unlike the aforementioned other Alexander, been neglected any hip-hop Broadway musicals. Pushkin's death was a divisive thing in Russian high society. Most of the St. Petersburg court sided with Dianthus and against Pushkin. Only Pushkin's closest friends stuck up for him in court. But outside of St. Petersburg, Pushkin had a pretty huge following. People from all over Russia, from various social groups, came to Pushkin's apartment to mourn and to pay their respects. So many people came to the Pushkin's apartment that the government was starting to get a little bit worried. Pushkin, mind you, was a well-known rabble-rouser and political radical. There was a pretty serious concern that his funeral, which at that time was open to the public, would turn into some kind of political demonstration. So, the government moved the funeral. Instead of the large St. Isaac's Cathedral in the middle of St. Petersburg, where the funeral was originally planned, Pushkin's funeral was moved to the much smaller and much less central Royal Stables Church. As well, the once public event was turned into a by-admission-only ticketed affair. The tickets were only available to the aristocracy and members of the diplomatic service. So, there would be no peasant rabble present. Then, after the funeral, Pushkin's body was shipped back to Mikhailovskaya, where he was buried beside his mother in the Gory Monastery. The end. If you are interested in learning more about Pushkin, I highly recommend reading some of his works. The most famous ones are Ruslan and Ludmila and Eugene Onegin. Aside from those two, I highly recommend reading some of his short stories, as I really think those are honestly super cool, and in my opinion are some of the best examples of exactly the kind of Russian influence that he is so famous for. And, of course, it is not particularly difficult to get your hands on his poetry, as he wrote some, multiple hundreds of poems in the 20 years that he was writing in. But with that, I think we're going to have to call it for today. Thank you all for listening today. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and that you learned something. If you did enjoy, or even if you didn't, please don't hesitate to leave me a review on whatever platform it is that you're listening on, or to leave me some kind of comment. As always, I appreciate greatly any kind of comments, reviews, whatever that you leave, because it helps me make the show better, and of course, it does make the algorithm happy, and if that's not the meaning of life, then I don't know what is. If you're interested in staying up to date on the podcast, please follow us at BTRSPod on Instagram. And once again, thank you all for listening. I hope you're having a great day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.